Hey guys, welcome to the channel. As you see in the thumbnail, what if Naruto is Guts' brother after being teleported to Berserk World? Before I start, please do support for more awesome content and subscribe my channel and like this video. Go support and follow the Mojothus Basamonkey for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story, link in the description. You know, you really have to learn to slow down. I won't always be there to look after you, little brother. Guts growled to himself as he raised his head out of the mud. He wiped the mud off of his visor so he could properly see, scowling up at his older brother who stood protectively over him. Mercenaries thundered by on both sides of them, on their way up to the castle they were hired to assault. The battering ram had just broken through the gate and it was time to earn their money. Guts had positioned himself at the front of the charge to ensure he got enough kills, only to be tripped from behind after only a few steps forward. You Naruto, I would have been up in there already if it wasn't for you. Guts knew he didn't have the brains that his older brother Naruto did, but it didn't take a genius to storm a castle. He pushed himself out of the mud, turning to his brother and stood on his toes to give him the height needed to look Naruto straight in his eyes. You want this just as bad as I do. Naruto smacked his younger brother upside the head as he looked to the sky in exasperation. I know I've taught you better than this. You see how the archers on the walls are facing inwards now. Now we can go without getting shot before we reach the wall. Let those poor fools tire themselves out for a bit before we go in and start gutting them. You know damn well you tire out too fast, swinging that sword around like you do. It's as tall as you are. He grabbed Guts by the shoulders and forced him around to face the castle, before he slapped him on the back and took off running towards the battle. Hurry up little brother, he called over his shoulder, or there won't be anything left for you. Guts hurried after the blonde, but his brother was too quick for him. By the time he made it to the melee, Naruto was nowhere to be seen. Guts noticed that the fighting had come to a standstill as the middle of the courtyard was being held by a giant armored man with an equally huge battle axe. Several bodies in various states of dismemberment already lay in a circle around him. The noble in charge of the assault was trying to marshal his men forwards, but no one wanted to be the first one to step up after seeing the slaughter. Appealing to the honor and sense of duty meant nothing to a mercenary army who would work for whomever had the coin. Guts recognized the desperation that the man was in as his assault was falling apart around him and managed to weasel an additional promise of 7 gold coins from him if he could kill the giant Bazuso. The crowd parted as Guts walked towards the giant, every eye in the castle watching the spectacle as people strained to listen. Bazuso was a showman and knew the value of psyching out his opponent. He barely started his speech though before Guts was upon him. The teenager's sword was so large and heavy that his initial assault was able to push Bazuso off balance. The giant barely got his axe up in time to block a huge overhead strike from Guts, only to bring his axe down to stop the next strike to his side. As the teen readjusted his footing after his failed attack, the giant took the moment to go on the offensive. His first strike was met head-on with Guts' sword. Their weapon's meeting point knocked a chip out of Bazuso's axe and sent hairline fractures up through the rest of it. The giant's next strike was a roundhouse blow aimed at Guts' head. Guts made a split-section decision to ignore the strike from the damaged weapon and put all his strength into a mid-level swing at his opponent. The axe struck Guts' helmet and split in half, pieces of the weapon flying everywhere like shrapnel while his helmet was sent flying, the chin strap unable to take the strain put on it. Guts' strike hit home, carving through Bazuso's armor, deep into his side. Bazuso fell to his knees, unable to hold up his weapon any longer. His last sight was Guts moving in for an overhead strike, which caved in his helmet and skull as it struck home. Naruto paid attention to the battle out of corner of his eye as he scaled the side of the castle wall, using his various cracks in the stonework caused by the earlier bombardment. He stealthily hoisted himself up into the hoarding, the wooden walkway attached to the side of the upper walls. He had spied helmets with plumage sticking out of them peeking over the rails and decided to investigate while everyone was distracted. He had hit pay dirt with his hunch. The general of the opposing army, as well as the local lord and his castellan, were watching his brother's duel with a few guards. Naruto silently drew a long dagger with his left hand while his right held onto a black hand axe. He would be needing stealth to pull this off perfectly, so his longsword would remain sheathed for now. Both of the guards had been standing a few steps back from their lord in a show of respect. This had set them up perfectly to receive a slit throat each before being soundlessly lowered to the ground. The 3 remaining occupants of the hoarding were all leaning out of the windows, now to watch the climax of the fight below, groaning as it looked like their champion was heading towards defeat. Naruto stepped forwards and grabbed the lord's hair, pulling it back and exposing the neck which soon received 2 quick stabs. The action was noticed by the general, who turned to confront the intruder while reaching for his sword. Naruto was ready for him though, and put his foot on the general's sword hand, trapping it against the hilt and stopping him from withdrawing his weapon. The look of disbelief on the general's face was ended in a flash as Naruto plunged his dagger up to the hilt through the man's eye and into his brain. The Castilian had taken off running the moment he saw the fight and had made it halfway down the wooden path before Naruto's thrown axe appeared in the back of his head. Naruto retrieved his weapons, cleaning them off on his victim's clothing before he drew his sword for the next part of his job. The holdfast on the other side of the courtyard also held an audience for Guts' fight below. A crew of mercenaries carefully watched the fight with the critical eye of fellow fighters. "It looks like the other side has some great ones too, right Griffith?" questioned one of Mercs. They were all mesmerized by the battle below them. The commander being addressed was a thin young man with pale skin and snow-white hair pouring out the bottom of his hawk-shaped helmet. He had glanced briefly at the duel below but kept his eye trained on the assassination of his employers across the way by the single blonde man. He felt no need to ward them, seeing as how his mercenary band had already been paid and the castle was clearly lost. "The castle is done for," he addressed his men. "Let's get out while we can." Everyone began to file towards the back of the castle, mad that their side had lost, but still proud of the fact that they had earned their pay. The temporary peace at the end of the battle was coming to an end. Both sides knew that they needed to re-engage their enemy if they hoped to win today. "They're weak now," shouted the noble leading the assault. "Cut them down and end it." He spurred his horse for effect, though it was marginalized due to him being at the back of his men. "We lost Bazuso, but we can still win this, men," shouted one of the defenders. They still had the advantages of their fixed defenses and the high ground after all. Guts lowered himself into a defense position. He was still in the middle of the open space from his duel and would be the first one to re-enter the fight. The defenders began to move towards him, eager to avenge their champion. "No." A voice echoed from above them, causing everyone to halt in their tracks again. Naruto knew he needed to act fast to save his little brother from being mobbed. He leaned out of the holdfast, holding the three severed heads of the Lord, General, and Castilian by their hair out for all to see. "Your castle is lost, and your leaders are dead. You have nothing left to fight for. Surrender now." He tossed the heads down to the middle of the courtyard for added effect, watching as they rolled to the feet of the front line of defenders who were staring in horror. There was a pause as they contemplated their situation before the first man threw down his palm. Once the sound of it hitting the ground was heard, a cacophony followed as the rest of the defenders disarmed to a man. A cheer rose up from the invaders as they realized that the battle was over and they were victorious. Guts watched as his older brother tossed a bag full of 50 gold in the air while they walked. They had cashed out and left the mercenary army after the campaign had ended and were on their way to the capital to try and find a new contract. He once again tried to figure out in his head just how Naruto and he could end up so different when they were raised exactly the same. He knew they weren't really brothers, but they had been raised together under Gambino after his wife had taken them in. Guts had been picked up as a baby from under the corpse of mother after she had been hung in a tree while pregnant. Gambino's wife Shisu had taken him in to replace her child that she had miscarried earlier. When he was 3, they had found Naruto. There had been a flash of light and an explosion one night. Gambino and his men had rushed through the forest to a clearing to find what looked like a blast site with flames licking the edges of the field. Naruto's 4-year-old body was found lying in a crater that had been so hot that the ground had fused into something glass-like. Shisu had adopted him as well after he had been taken back to camp to heal. Naruto had no memories from before the blast besides his name. Shisu had fallen ill and died when Guts was 4, leaving him and Naruto at the tender mercies of Gambino. The mercenary leader blamed Guts for his wife's death due to her finding him as a baby under his dead mother. He was considered a bad omen. Gambino knew better than to throw away potential recruits though and officially adopted them into the mercenary band. He proceeded to train them into the ground daily, toughening them up as quickly as possible. Guts had started out with a sword way too big for him but was too stubborn to admit he couldn't handle it. This led to him developing a style of his own revolving around working with massive blades and a crossbow to back it up when needed. Naruto on the other hand had concentrated on speed and dodging with the necessary strength to back it up. He would rather use a different type of weapon in each hand when possible to allow him more flexibility in the battlefield. Where Guts would act like a berserker, wading headfirst into battle until it had ended, Naruto believed in surgical strikes where you cut off the head of the enemy and let the body die. The brothers complemented each other's strengths and covered for each other's weaknesses. Gambino encouraged this as it meant he had to spend less time babysitting them on the battlefield. It also made the two nearly inseparable though. One night Gambino had been heavily drinking and had sold Guts for the night to the pedophile of their group, Donovan, a large brutish man. Guts had been gathering water for his tent when he was blindsided and dragged off. He woke up in Donovan's tent with a big mien looming over him telling him what his fate for the night would be. Naruto had been out searching to Guts after he hadn't returned and heard his brother's cries for help. He rushed into the tent only to find Donovan about to mount his brother. In a fit of rage, Naruto pulled his dagger, plunged it into the man's neck, then pushed him off of his brother. The rest of the mercenaries had heard the commotion and surrounded the tent. They were confused to see Guts leave the tent wrapped in a blanket until Naruto followed after him with his dagger still dripping blood. He took one look at them and stated plainly, "Anyone who lays a finger on my brother will die by my hand." His voice was cold, but the men could have sworn that his eyes had flashed red for a moment. No one stepped up to confront them on the issue, so the boys continued back to their tent, leaving the mercenaries to argue over how to deal with Donovan's body. Gambino lost his leg in a skirmish a few days after Guts' 8th birthday. The brothers officially became the breadwinners of their house, while Gambino spent his time drinking heavily and playing with a dog he had adopted while they were on the road. Naruto would receive praise for his accomplishments, but nothing Guts did was worth anything but scorn. It was up to Naruto to encourage Guts and let him know he was doing well. Then one day, Guts returned from the battlefield with an extra reward for killing the enemy leader. Gambino ignored this completely and struck Guts in the face with his crutch for not getting meat for his dog. Naruto watched this happen from the tent's entrance, knowing that things would soon come to a head. That night, Gambino's pain became too much. His life was worthless without his wife and without his leg. He decided he had to end the reason for his suffering and attacked Guts that night. Naruto had been having a bad dream and had woken up with a start to find Gambino laying on top of a bruised Guts with a sword sticking out of his neck. The room reeked of alcohol, blood, and death. The fire had started when the lamp lighting the tent had been knocked over. Naruto took all this in, then grabbed Guts' hand and pulled him outside. Naruto climbed up on Gambino's horse and pulled Guts up in front of him before taking off into the night. They had only made it a short ways before the rest of the mercenary band was upon them, looking for vengeance for their slain leader. Naruto was shot with a crossbow bolt, having it travel through his side and into Guts, who sat in front of him. They fell from the horse into the ravine that they had been riding next to. The mercenaries gave up the chase at that point, knowing the boys were near death and not willing to risk injury going down the steep slope in the dark. Naruto had used his body to cushion Guts during the fall and had been knocked out. The bolt had torn free from Guts but still remained in his body. Guts shakily raised himself to his feet, still holding Gambino's sword and trying to recognize his surroundings. He noticed movement in the distance, only to discover a pack of wolves had tracked the scent of blood to him and Naruto. Guts stood over his brother's body, sword raised and waiting for the wolves to strike. The pack leader threw itself at Guts only to be impaled on his sword, taking them both to the ground. Guts was barely able to push the dead body off of him and get back up in time to sill the next wolf that had moved in to take a bite of Naruto's leg. A few minutes later, the wolves were dead, their blood steaming in the cold night air as Guts collapsed next to his brother, passing out utterly exhausted from his flight and subsequent fight. A traveling mercenary band noticed their bodies a few hours later and made the decision to rescue the boys to see if they had the potential to become fighters later on. That was almost 4 years ago, Guts reflected to himself as they walked. He couldn't believe how fast time had passed for them since then. He was 13 years old now, standing at 5'2", with a large body and developed muscles due to growing up on the battlefield and using his oversized sword. His nose had a large scar running across it courtesy of Gambino on the night he escaped, and he kept his black hair cut decently short to avoid it interfering with his fighting. He had upgraded it over the years to ensure that its eyes grew to match his body's growth as well. Using a smaller sword now just felt wrong. His brother Naruto had just turned 14, being a few months older than him. He was 5'5" now and had a body nearly as developed as Guts now, with a focus on speed instead of power. His long blonde locks poured down to frame a perpetually smiling face with faint whisker marks on his cheeks. No one ever asked about their origin and they were widely assumed to be birthmarks. Guts thought they made his brother look like a fox. Their heads both perked up and as they heard a horse whinny from a hill to their left. They seen any riders yet, so they continued on at a quick pace, hoping to put some distance between themselves and whatever group was near them. Porcus was plotting again. The last contract that he and his men had participated in paid well enough for a simple castle defense. Unfortunately, it ended too soon for his tastes. Now he was still short on money to pay the debts he had accrued getting his armor upgraded and needed another option before he was blackballed by the blacksmith and armorer guilds. He could always ask Griffith for a loan from the treasury, but his pride had taken enough of a hit already without admitting he couldn't handle his own finances. As if the gods were providing an answer to his prayers, he saw 2 travelers on the road below them. They looked well armed, but nothing a team of 10 or so men couldn't handle. He took a moment to further examine his prey, only to grow even more giddy. He called his men over and pointed down at the road. "Look, it's the guy who killed Bazuso yesterday. He must have gotten a reward for the kill. I bet his pockets are well lined." His team was getting psyched up enough to ride with him when one of the newer guys decided to pour water on the fire. "I don't know," he said. That guy managed to drop a 20-man slayer like it was nothing, and the blonde down there is the one who annihilated our side's leadership. I don't think it's worth the risk." Just like that, 4 of the 10 men with him stepped back and headed back to the rest of the group. Gorkas knew he needed to act fast to save face and make sure he wasn't going to end up running the attack solely by himself. "We can handle them fine, guys. You 3 will separate the blonde away while we finish off the other one. We'll join you afterwards if you need help." The men nodded at this and mounted up. Gorkas ignored Casca's faint chuckling, knowing that he couldn't afford to get drawn into an argument that would make him lose more face at this point. He started the charge down the hill, slowing his horse enough to let the brasher members of his group get a lead. Naruto observed the 7 riders charging them, while Guts took the moment given to get in a battle stance. He saw the leader fall back somewhat and grinned to himself. "I see someone else subscribes to my battle methods," he thought. 3 of the riders had split off to attack Guts directly. Naruto watched his brother kill the first rider with a slash to the side and took the arm off the second one. He watched another rider break from the group to try his luck with the blonde instead. Naruto sighed to himself at the amateur tactics while drawing his dagger and throwing it through the visor of the attacker and burying it in his nasal cavity. The rest of the men looked ready to cut and run at this point, and Gorkas knew he had to lead the next attack himself to keep them there. He spurred his horse at Naruto, seeing how the blonde hadn't retrieved his dagger and didn't possess any more of them. Naruto slowly drew his hand axe while assessing the distance of the enemy rider. When the horse was about 10 lengths away, Naruto drew back and hurled his axe into the horse's neck, making it crash forward and hurling its rider into the air. Gorkas came crashing down and slid on his belly to stop at Naruto's feet. He rolled over with a groan and looked up to see a pair of blue eyes looking at him with both amusement and a promise of violence. Naruto moved to draw his sword, only to jump back as an arrow flew into the space his head had just occupied. He looked up to see a pretty boy in white armor, a female raider, and an 8-foot-tall man built like a brick shithouse, all bearing down on him and his brother. "You know we're going to need to separate to avoid getting overwhelmed," Naruto said to Guts. "Whoever gets the 2-on-1 battle will just try to stay alive until the other can help him." Guts nodded to the idea before sprinting across the road to wait for the attack. The pretty boy broke off to follow Guts, his eyes focused like a bird of prey on its next meal. Naruto didn't have any more time to watch though, as he parried the woman's strike, only to need to duck under the mace strike from the big man before he could capitalize. He maneuvered until the woman's horse was in between himself and the giant, then blocked her next strike with a single hand, leaving his other arm free to strike a nerve on her thigh, where the armor ended. With her leg deadened, she was unable to maneuver her horse and still swing her sword effectively. Naruto was able to yank her from her horse in the next round of strikes, pulling her back to his chest with an arm around her waist while he held his sword to her throat. The giant had immediately stopped, allowing Naruto to glance towards his brother's fight, only to find Guts passed out on the ground with the pretty boy kneeling over him. The raider was staring a hole through Naruto while he kept his sword at Guts' neck. No one moved as they each tried to find a way out of the situation without being placed in a worse position. Naruto knew time was his enemy in this and decided to take the initiative. "My name is Naruto, and that is my brother Guts, who you are kneeling on. I'd like to know the name of the man I'm speaking with." The white-haired man nodded at the request. "My name is Griffith and I'm the leader of the Band of the Hawk. You are holding my second-in-command Casca at the moment." Naruto rose an eyebrow at this, not realizing the true value of his hostage until now. His attention returned to the conversation as Griffith continued. "I'd like to propose a temporary truce for the time being. I need to attend to my men, and your brother has a hole opened up near his heart that needs attending to before he bleeds out. We can continue this after we have recovered. I'll offer up my medics to help treat him if you'll allow it. He has impressed me greatly, and I don't want to see his life wasted." Naruto knew there was more to it than that simple explanation, but the longer he waited, the worse Guts became. He lowered his sword and pushed Casca forward, get some distance from the angry woman. She wheeled around, ready to continue the fight, only to have the giant grab her and throw her over his shoulder. He nodded to Naruto and spoke slowly and deeply. "I'm Pippin. Grab your brother and I'll show you the way to the medical tent." Naruto threw Guts over his shoulder and hustled after Pippin towards the white tent in the middle of the camp. Guts was out for 2 days, his body going into a mild case of shock due to blood loss. Naruto tried to help but had to settle for waiting and guarding the tent. He was surprised to see Casca approach the tent wearing a robe about an hour after the doctor gave Griffith and him an update on Guts' condition. She motioned for access to the tent with a tilt of her head. Naruto frowned at the strange behavior but opened the tent flap for her before following her in. She stood there for a moment, silently staring at Guts and contemplating something before her expression shifted to resignation as she came to a decision. She addressed Naruto without turning around. "Griffith ordered me to lay with your brother and keep him warm. I need your approval to do it." She mistook Naruto's surprised expression for one of distrust and proceeded to allow the rope to fall to her feet. She spun around slowly with her arms out to her sides. As you can see, I'm no threat and I don't even possess a weapon. Naruto chuckled at her comment before correcting her. I know just how deadly you can be without any weapon on your person, my lady. I thank you for what you are about to do for my brother though, and if you need any assistance, I'll be maintaining my vigil right outside the tent. He handed Casca back her robe, gave a quick kiss to her hand, and walked out of the tent. Casca turned to his brother with a light blush still on her face. She wasn't used to being treated as anything more than one of the guys and didn't know how to handle chivalry directed at herself. She climbed into bed with Guts, pulling the covers up over herself and hoping that he would recover sooner than later. Guts woke up feeling worse than when he had his first hangover. His side was bandaged up and still tender as hell. He could see a small amount of blood seeping through the bandages, but still counted it as a win, considering how close it was to his heart. He was surprised to not see Naruto anywhere as he stuck his head outside the tent flap. He closed his eyes and simply listened for a second before he heard his brother's voice. Opening his eyes, he headed in that direction, noticing the angry eyes of most of the camp as he walked by. He wasn't surprised. He was an outsider wherever he went, though his brother always managed to fit into whatever group they were with. Speaking of the devil, he rounded a corner only to see his brother sitting around a campfire with a giant and woman he had fought earlier, along with a younger blonde pre-teenager and a young blonde man with shoulder-length straight hair. His brother had just finished with his story, and the majority of them were laughing openly, with the woman cracking a soft smile. Naruto noticed Guts' approach and stood up to greet him. There's my little brother back from the dead. I was wondering how long you were going to sleep. I had intended to shave your eyebrows if you were still out of it tonight. Guts drew back in horror as the rest laughed. He knew Naruto didn't make idle threats like that, he fully intended to carry it out. You can thank Casca here, his brother gestured to the woman, for laying with you for 2 days to take care of you during your recovery from blood loss. Guts turned to the woman and gave her a stiff nod. Thank you. It appears I owe you one now. He was about to continue on, but she had already crossed the distance and punched him right in his wound. Guts sank down to his knees in pain, only able to mutter a soft bitch under his breath as his world spun around him. Casca scowled as she stared at the pig that she had to lay with. I only did it because Griffith ordered me to, she said with a look of disgust before storming off. She had learned from previous experiences that she had to make it clear early on that it meant nothing or he might get the wrong idea. Naruto shook his head as he watched his brother try to stand again. You still have a way with the ladies, I see. He pointed towards the large tent near the end of the camp. Griffith refused to speak with me until you woke up. He demanded that you be part of any discussion. We should head over there now if you're up for it. Guts gave him a quick nod and started moving in the tent's direction, his brother falling in beside him. Griffith was standing outside of his tent talking with Casca. He gave the brothers a smile as they approached. I'm sorry about avoiding our talk, he addressed Naruto, but I'd imagine you would both want to hear my offer. He turned to Guts with a smile. I want you, Guts. Guts reared back as if he had just found a snake. Are you a homo? He bluntly asked. Naruto barely avoided facepalming at his brother's lack of manners. Griffith could only laugh though. No, he chuckled, I was there 4 days ago in the castle when you fight Basuzo. If his axe wasn't cracked you would have lost your head. After Guts agreed with him, Griffith couldn't help but admire him for his honesty. It's like you bet your life whenever you charge into battle no matter how large or numerous the enemy is, yet you also struggle just as hard to make it out alive afterwards. That is why I want you. Griffith then turned to Naruto. Your brother is easy to read, he lives his life like an open book. You on the other hand are like a mystery wrapped in an enigma. You are obviously extremely skilled in direct combat from what I have seen, yet you took the sneaky route of assassinating the enemy leadership instead of participating directly in the battle. You are one of the most cheerful people I have met with an open warm smile, yet I also have seen your serious expression as you have held a sword to Casca's throat. Even more amazing is that she has already forgiven you for it. Naruto blinked at the detailed description of himself. He hadn't figured Griffith had enough time to notice all of those details about himself. Griffith continued on as the blonde refocused on him. I don't understand your motivations yet, but I'd be a fool to not want your skills at my side in the Band of the Hawk. He turned to encompass both brothers at this point. So what do you say? Guts leaned forwards before Naruto had time to even think of a reply. You piss me off. He said pointing at Griffith. Who the hell are you to act like you know me when we just met? It makes me sick, besides the fact that your group attacked us and I've already killed 2 of your men. We're enemies. Griffith took a step back in surprise. What do you intend to do then? He asked. That's easy, said Guts as he raised his sword. We'll settle it with ease. If I win I get to put a matching hole in your chest. If you win then I'll be your soldier, or fag boy, or whatever. Griffith closed his eyes for a moment before reopening them and raising his sword towards Guts. I agree. I don't like to doing these things by force, but I can respect your decision. He turned to Casca, who had come running once she had seen the swords drawn. Stay out of this, Casca. I will obtain what I desire. Casca hung her head as she stepped back to watch the fight. What say you? He questioned, turning towards Naruto. Will you abide by your brother's agreement as well? Naruto shrugged, looking between Guts and Griffith. I can abide by them, though I'll be damned if I go gay for anyone. Guts can fill that role all by himself. Griffith nodded, turning around to see Guts' sword already on its way towards his head. He quickly parried it, along with the follow-up blows, choosing to retaliate by slashing light cuts all over Guts to get his point across that he could win any time he wanted. Naruto had walked over to stand by Casca. He shook his head as he observed the fight. Griffith was making a deadly mistake in delaying the match's outcome. Guts became more dangerous as the fight continued. Guts realized he wasn't going to win in a straight-up sword battle, so after the next series of clashes, he buried the top portion of his sword in the dirt. As Griffith closed in to capitalize, Guts threw the dirt his sword had plowed up right in his opponent's face. Griffith reeled back, furiously scrubbing his eyes as Guts moved in for a full overhead strike, looking to split Griffith in two. He hadn't followed the move fully, but 1 second he was getting ready to finish Griffith, and the next he had his sword stuck in the dirt, with Griffith perched on top of it, holding his smaller sword inches from Guts' neck. Do you yield? Asked the leader of the Hawks. Guts just snorted before responding in scorn. Let me show you how a mouth is really supposed to be used in battle. With that said, he bit down on Griffith's sword, holding it in his teeth. Blood could be seen trickling out of the corner of his mouth. Griffith was too stunned to react quickly, so Guts took the initiative of forcing both of them to tumble down the hillside. They landed hard at the bottom, but Guts recovered first and was able to catch Griffith with a vicious cross that drew blood from the white-haired boy's mouth. Guts felt extremely proud of himself knowing that he had mostly likely popped the perfect boy's cherry for getting hit. He made his fatal mistake of lunging into a body tackle at Griffith. The Hawks leader simply dodged to the side, letting Guts pass by before putting him in an armbar with only inches from dislocating his shoulder. Do you yield? He asked the stubborn teen. Guts' only response was go to hell as he still tried to get out of the hold. Griffith leaned forwards, and with a loud pop that echoed over the clearing the fight was over, and Guts was once again immobile. Griffith caught Naruto's nod of recognition for his win and turned to his men, who had come running as they witnessed the fight. I give you the newest members of the Hawks, Guts and Naruto. The men cheered. They were all mercenaries and understood the battlefield politics. Yesterday's enemy was tomorrow's ally. It would also do their group a world of good to add 2 bruisers to their ranks like Naruto and Guts. The men broke out casks of wine and ale to celebrate. Naruto joined the fire with his new friends after carrying Guts back to the infirmary again. He was assured that his brother would be up and moving before the party ended. The party had ended and everyone had passed out asleep. Some had made it to their tents, while others didn't make it off of the grass they had started out the night sitting on. The moon was high in the sky, full and bathing the land in its soft glow. 2 figures could be seen facing each other on top of the hilltop that Guts had fought on earlier. Naruto and Griffith squared off with their respective weapons. Just to make this clear, this has no effect on the deal earlier, stated Griffith. I can't lead men that I'm not confident I can beat. We need to know where we stand on who is a better fighter. I couldn't agree more, said Naruto as he and Griffith raced towards each other, the clashes of their weapons lighting up the night. Naruto woke up to see the moon higher in the sky, then he remembered it being. His body hurt all over, convincing him that sitting up wasn't worth it at the moment. His torso, arms, and legs were all littered with shallow cuts, though the one on his right forearm was quite deep and would probably require a few stitches to close up. He had earned at least 1 scar from his brawl with his new leader that night. His ears picked up a soft groan, causing him to turn his head to the left. Griffith was sprawled out next to him, his body littered with cuts as well. The mercenary leader was holding the side of his head with one hand while gently probing his swollen left eyelid with his other hand. Both of them could tell that it would develop into one hell of a black eye over the next few days. He wasn't in any hurry to get up either, though he still had the strength to turn his head and give his opponent a smug smile. Naruto subconsciously bristled at the cockiness shown to him, but held his tongue until his initial response had passed and his face returned to a tired smile. You know you're an asshole, right? He said as he looked over at Griffith. We have an epicing battle for over an hour, and you win it by kicking me in the nuts and kneeing me in the face. That's not exactly something you can brag to a lady about. Griffith snorted, though he regretted it immediately as his concussion flared up again. I may act refined to deal with people at a higher station, but in the end we're all just mercenaries. Honor doesn't matter when our life is on the line. That was a legitimate win, and I wouldn't have done it if you hadn't dropped your weapons and started punching me in the face. You know you deserved it, Naruto. And I wouldn't have done that if you hadn't made a comment about how my sword must have reflected my dick size and Guts must have gotten all of the good genes. We aren't even related. Naruto leveraged himself up, though he made sure to take a wide stance to avoid damaging his goods any further. He offered a hand to Griffith and once taken, pulled the other boy up to his feet as well. Griffith swayed on his feet, the quick movement causing the earth under him to seem like it was moving on its own. Naruto threw his leader's arm over his shoulder and they slowly began their long trek back to the camp at the bottom of the hill. "So do you feel like you have a better idea of what drives me now?" he asked. Griffith slowly nodded as he gathered his thoughts. "You seem to fight for others, more than yourself. But only for those that have earned a place in your heart like Guts. I'm hoping that myself and the rest of your new comrades can eventually earn a spot there as well." Naruto could respect that honesty. Griffith didn't sugarcoat anything when a straight answer would suffice. He supposed it was just another trait of mercenaries, needing to get to the point quickly and cleanly when money and lives were involved. He angled himself towards Griffith and offered his fist. Griffith stared at it for a moment before realizing the significance. He offered a small smile before he brought up his fist to bump Naruto's. Nothing more needed to be said about the fight after that. He had earned the support and respect of his newest member of the Band of the Hawk. Naruto glanced towards a tree halfway down the hill, noticing as a dark shape ducked back behind the trunk. "Do you want to talk to our audience?" "No," Griffith answered as they slowly continued on. "She needed to see that as much as we needed to do it. She'll spread the word so we won't have to." Naruto suddenly grinned as they limped on. "You know Guts is going to be pissed that he lost so badly to you, right?" Asuka couldn't believe what she had just seen. She had been with the Band of the Hawk for years now, since she was a preteen girl. She had embraced its morals and values fully and loved everyone in it as if they were her family. Their leader Griffith was someone she had always looked up to from day one. He had always seemed larger than life and nigh indestructible. It was a great comfort to her to know that no matter how tough an opponent they fought, Griffith was always stronger. He was the Band of the Hawk's ace in the hole that they could always fall back on. And she had just witnessed him almost get defeated. She had seen Griffith and Naruto leave the camp together earlier that night and had decided to follow them. They had proceeded back to the hill where Griffith had defeated Guts earlier that afternoon. She had expected them to talk now that they had privacy from the rest, but they had simply drew their weapons and faced off from each other. Asuka had found herself at a crossroads at that point in time. Her duty to go out and defend Griffith was at war with her desire to remain hidden and observe what looked to be an incredible fight. She finally chose to stay hidden and was almost immediately rewarded as both Griffith and Naruto surged forwards to clash under the full moon's light. The battle was incredible to behold from her hiding place. The attacks from both boys were swift and deadly, neither wanting to give their opponent a chance to compose himself. Griffith found himself at a minor disadvantage from the onset. Naruto had watched his battle with Guts carefully and adjusted his fighting style to counter Griffith's favorite tactics. Naruto would use his long sword one-handed to engage Griffith from a distance. Then when Griffith would parry it to move in closer allowing him to counterattack, Naruto would come in with his hand axe in his offhand. Griffith would have no choice but to fall back seeing as how his sword was already engaged and had no way to defend himself. The axe's black tint made it difficult to detect in the moonlight until it was almost too close to react to. The fight shifted as Griffith was finally able to send Naruto's axe flying with a lucky deflection. With each boy only having one remaining weapon, they started closing the distance between them. Cuts soon started appearing all over both of their bodies as they began to banter with each other in hope of breaking the stalemate. Asuka couldn't hear the dialogue from her hiding place, but she nearly had a heart attack when she saw Naruto's eyes flare at something Griffith had said to him. The blonde man had thrown down his sword and in less than a blink had knocked Griffith's sword from his hand before pulling in the surprised man by the collar and punching him in the head twice with an incredible force. Griffith had hurriedly backed away, trying to gain some distance to recover from the unexpected assault. He was barely able to make out Naruto charging at him again, even faster than he was a moment ago. Griffith gave a fake hook to Naruto's head, then when the blonde raised his arms to defend, the mercenary leader kicked him right between the legs with enough force to raise his feet off of the ground. Naruto fell to his knees, his eyes tearing up and his whole body quivering as he held himself. As his eyes uncrossed themselves and began to refocus, the last thing he saw was a knee heading right for his face. Asuka blew out a sigh of relief as she watched Naruto fall onto his back, knocked out and unmoving. Griffith pitched over less than a second later, utterly spent from what turned out to be one of the toughest fights of his life. Casca had only made it one step from the tree towards her leader when she saw both boys begin to move again. To her surprise, they had already begun treating each other like comrades instead of enemies, the previous fight already placed into the past. Men, she muttered to herself. She had never understood how someone could let go of a grudge so fast after drawing blood from each other. She watched the two limp back to the camp before slowly making her way back herself. Asuka stopped off by one of the closer bonfires, sitting down and staring at the flames as if in a trance as she thought about what she had just witnessed. She had completely tuned out the outside world around her and was startled when a hand lightly fell on her shoulder, getting her attention. She whipped around, only to find three of her closer friends Rickard, Pippin, and Judo, all staring at her with looks of concern. "Do you want to talk about it?" offered Judo as they sat around her, sharing in the fire's heat. Casca debated with herself for a moment before telling the boys what she had seen on the hill that night. She didn't notice as the other conversations around them died out as more and more people were drawn into her narrative about the clash of the titans, Griffith and Naruto. As she finished, she noticed that at least 50 people had surrounded her, all hanging on her next word. Conversations immediately started up all around her as people debated what it meant for someone to come so close to defeating Griffith. Casca bid her friends good night and started out towards her tent again. She had almost made it before she saw shadows moving towards the tent Guts was recovering in. She set out after them, finding Corcus and 4 of his followers gathered outside of Guts' tent. Corcus was giving a quick pep talk to the others about gaining revenge for their buddies that had died by Guts' blade. Asuka was sorely tempted to let them continue on with their plan, just for the opportunity of having some of the more stupid members of the Band of the Hawk get themselves killed. Unfortunately, she was also the Hawk second in command and was responsible for all of their safety, whether she liked them or not. Her warning to the men was promptly ignored as they tried to draw her into their plot. At this point she began to lose her temper, and one drawn sword later, the plotters went scurrying off into the night with their tails between their legs. She heard the tent flap move aside, causing her to turn towards the figure emerging. Guts was giving her a sullen look as he stood there in a pair of pants with his torso wrapped in bandages. "That makes 2 that I owe you," he mumbled. "So I'll say thanks for now." Casca was somewhat confused by her feelings at that point. She enjoyed knowing that someone so powerful owed her a favor, and if she was honest with herself, he didn't look half bad. On the other hand, she absolutely hated that Griffith had said he wanted Guts for the Hawks. Griffith had never said that to anyone before, and her jealousy was making itself known as she felt Guts hadn't done anything to deserve such an honor. "Don't get it wrong," she growled at him as she turned to walk off. "I'm just following Griffith's orders. Go ahead and get yourself killed in battle." Guts coolly stared at her back as she retreated back into the night. He would be the first to admit he didn't have that much experience with women, unlike his brother, but Casca just struck him as more unbalanced than most. The gust of wind hit him, causing an involuntary shiver down his spine. He ducked back into the tent to throw on a shirt and strap on his sword before he set out into the night to locate his brother. He hadn't seen his brother since his fight with Griffith earlier that afternoon. With Corcus and his crew running around plotting death, he wanted to make sure Naruto was safe. As he walked between the tents, he received smiles and greetings from some of the Hawks that were still awake. He had to admit that it was a nice change from the dirty and suspicious looks he had gotten that morning. Most of them seemed distracted though, and as he listened he was able to gather that his brother had his own initiation battle with Griffith as well, and had lost too. He followed the glow to the central bonfire for the camp. He found his brother lying on the ground, propped up against a log with a mug of ale in his hand and a cold compress soaked in river water sitting on his lap. Naruto smiled at his brother as Guts made his way over to sit beside him. They sat in silence for a few minutes, just watching the camp life around them. Each trapped in their own thoughts, reflecting on their battles earlier. Guts had gotten the actual story from Naruto about his fight with Griffith and was impressed that his brother did so well. He also felt slightly proud of himself that at least he didn't get defeated by a kick to his balls. Guts was beginning to grow annoyed as the fifth Kampor propositioned herself to him. He was in too much pain to enjoy himself for what it would cost, even if the girl was quite beautiful. He heard a slight whimper and turned his head to see Naruto following the girl's ass as she walked off. He winced to himself as he shifted his position trying to get comfortable and avoid getting aroused when his goods were so tender from their beating earlier. Naruto bid his brother good night as he began to slowly shuffle limp towards his own tent, hoping to put the night behind himself and hopefully start the healing process. Guts watched his brother slowly walk off before grinning to himself and made his way over to the whore's tent. He gathered the 10 women around himself, loving the fact that they all were beautiful young girls, without an ugly girl among them. "Ladies," he began, "how would you all like to earn some easy money tonight? I'll pay you all a silver piece each if you'll help me with a little issue I need to take care of." The girls looked at each other before nodding and followed Guts as he moved quietly towards Naruto's tent. Stopping outside of hearing distance, Guts gathered the girls in close to him while handing out the money. "Everyone now," he ordered. Once they complied, he spoke in a whisper. "You all know my brother Naruto, right?" The girls all nodded, remembering the handsome blonde from earlier. "Well, he's alone in that tent over there, injured and damn near helpless. I need you all to go in there and help the healing process if you know what I mean for the rest of the night. No matter what he says or how much he begs, you don't let up until you're all satisfied, understand? The girls all nodded with resolute looks on their faces, eager to help the poor man. They all moved towards the tent, one girl stopping to offer Guts a salute before rejoining the group. Guts waited for a moment as the last girl entered the tent before walking over and tying the flaps shut from the outside, trapping everyone inside of it. He heard giggling from inside before his brother awoke with a start. And now ladies, he heard the fear in his brother's voice. You're all beautiful, but I don't think it's the best time for this. After that there was an unmanly shriek as the tent began to sway from the movement inside of it. Guts walked off with a smirk, knowing that he may have lost the battle earlier, but he had won the war that night. 1 month later. Pasca walked through the ranks of riders lined up on the castle's drawbridge. The men joked with each other in low voices, but kept a sharp eye out, ready for either a signal from their leaders to begin the mission or for any enemy action. She spied the 2 newest members of the Hawks talking lowly to each other from close to the back of the pack. Guts was easy to see from any distance, his sword was too big to hide and identified him to all. His outfit and armor consisting of dull colors, touched up by soot from a fire pit to stop light reflections. Naruto sat on a horse next to him, tougher to make out in the crowd. He had his standard weapons, but also wore a pouch over his shoulder with an opening at the top for easy access. What was kept in there was anyone's guess since he kept the contents a closely guarded secret. He wore an outfit similar to Guts, but with a full helmet to help conceal his bright blonde hair. Assignments had just been passed out to different people. Everyone knew their given role, including Guts, who had been trusted with rearguard duty, one of the most important positions in the upcoming attack. Casca was still trying to understand if Griffith had assigned Guts' role because he was expendable or because he knew of a hidden skill the boy possessed that she just couldn't see. Either way, many lives rode on his job performance that night. Strangely enough, Griffith hadn't given a job to Naruto. She knew she wasn't the only one to notice this as mumbling was heard up and down the line as the men tried to figure out what purpose the special treatment was for. Pasca knew she just had to trust Griffith's judgment in the end, but she didn't enjoy how much the 2 newbies caused him to deviate from what the rest of the men knew as standard. The band of the Hawks' current contract had them defending a local lord and his castle from an invading army belonging to his neighbor. It had quickly been determined by Griffith that the enemy's 2,000 men were way too large to engage in open combat. This meant that hit and run tactics would be needed to bleed them dry. The Hawks had spent weeks harrying the enemy's supply lines to the point that all of the remaining resources had been put together under guard in the middle of the camp, despite the possible dangers from doing so. Tonight was the perfect time to finish them off. With no more supplies, the enemy camp would have to disband and return home or risk starving. With Griffith's signal given, the Hawks set off into the night single file down the dark trail towards the river. The horses were packed tightly together so as to lose anyone. No torches were allowed, the moon providing the only illumination. Once the procession reached the river, everyone dismounted and led their horses upstream, wading through the waist-deep water. Yudo and Naruto were scouting ahead of the group and signaled for a stop as they sighted 3 soldiers doing their laundry on the shore. One soldier finished up and started his way back towards the camp. Naruto signaled to Judo that he would take the lone man before slinking off into the brush. Judo waited until the count of 5 before throwing 2 throwing knives into the necks of the men, causing their bodies to splash face first into the river. A moment later Naruto appeared from the woods with the last soldier thrown over his soldier with a slit throat. The rest of the group hurried up to the scouts, leading their horses from the water and mounting back up into formation. The path is clear all the way back to the camp, Naruto reported. Griffith acknowledged the information before turning to the men. You all know your assignments. Keep the formations tight and attack quickly and decisively. Pay attention for the signal to retreat. Our success depends on the enemy not being able to regroup before we leave. Now let's move out. The attack had begun. Jared cursed his luck as he sat out in the cold with the wind whipping around him. He had drawn night watch on the camp's perimeter for the last week and a half, ever since he had accidentally bumped into the captain while trying to get into the chow line before the limited supplies had run out. No one was eating their fill, and tempers were frayed all over. Men had already started to abandon the camp in small numbers, their hunger overriding their sense of duty. He was barely staying as it was, given the treatment he was receiving. It took him a moment to realize that the forest had started to get lighter, as if dawn was starting to show through. It was way too early for the sun to make an appearance though, and the light soon resolved into hundreds of individual torches carried by riders as they made their way out of the woods behind the camp. This Jared thought to himself as he made a point of slowly laying down his pike and walking towards the group with his hands over his head. He noticed his fellow sentries up and down the line following his example. None of them were feeling particularly loyal at this point in time. A man without a torch, instead carrying a hand axe, rode forward to meet Jared slowly. Where is the command tent? He asked without even bothering to look at the defeated guard. Jared silently pointed toward a gaudy-looking tent near the back of the camp that was still lit up from work being done inside. "Much thanks," said the stranger. Jared hadn't realized until now just how young most of the riders seemed. They barely looked to be in their teens. "Lead your men towards the river, then follow it out of the area. That's your safest bet to avoid the fires," murmured the man before taking off into the camp without waiting for the rest of his group while reaching towards a bag he held on his back. Jared signaled to his fellow deserters to follow him towards the woods. He watched the rest file past him into the tree line before he stopped to turn and watch what would happen next. The man in dull white armor, shrouded in a cloak, raised his hand, silently gathering the attention of the rest of the raiders. They all seemed to be waiting for a signal through hell if Jared could tell what it was. At that moment, the command tent went up in a giant ball of flame. Jared could feel the heat wave all the way back in the trees. He grinned to himself as he took off running after his men, knowing that there wouldn't be any retribution to them now with the leaders all taken care of. Griffith let his arm fall, spurring his horse forward. Hundreds of men faithfully followed after him, all holding torches. The camp's population was still reeling from the explosion that had just occurred and was wholly unprepared to deal with the raiders bearing down on them. Tents were randomly set ablaze by thrown torches, some still containing their inhabitants who awoke to an inferno that had no possibility of escape. Screams echoed throughout the camp as the riders made their way towards the supply tents. Distance was put between the raiders and the supplies immediately once the tents went up. This proved an intelligent decision as the gunpowder stored in them ignited, causing an even larger explosion to occur. The resulting fireball illuminated the raiders to the rest of the camp as they escaped down the trail towards the castle that was just recently under siege. The highest-ranking officer left, a captain on guard duty at the front of the camp, grit his teeth in rage as he watched his entire command go up in smoke around him. "Grab every rider that you can," he shouted at anyone who would listen as he made his way towards the stables. "They are not getting away with this cowardly attack." He kicked his horse, taking off down the trail, followed by a few hundred riders in various states of armament, hastily thrown on during the attack. Guts followed the rest of the Hawks back down the trail. He had spent the better part of the raid with his mind oscillating between admiration at how professionally it was carried out and wondering why Griffith would trust him with such a key position when he felt he hadn't done anything to prove his worth yet. He looked over his shoulder to see the enemy rider slowly gaining on his group. There was only so fast people could ride in the dark on a crowded narrow trail, and Guts could see that he needed to buy time. He deliberately slowed down the pace of his horse, allowing the front runners of the enemy to catch up to him. He dodged their clumsy attacks before using his mammoth blade, one-handed, to cut them open and drop them from their horses. This intimidation tactic had the opposite effect on the enemy, enraging them further and causing them to speed up even more. Guts' next stall attempt turned better results. He waited until 3 riders had him surrounded before cutting the front legs of their horses, bringing them down into the dirt. This created an effective roadblock of flesh that had to be navigated around, slowing the charge and giving the Hawks the time they needed to finish queuing onto the trail. The enemy commander saw this and ordered his riders forward en masse. The majority of them kept Guts occupied, while a few slipped by to engage the back of the Hawks riders. Guts saw this happening and bowled forward, barely reaching the attack in time to save Rickard from taking a sword to his back. The Hawks had made it over 3/4 of the way back to their base at this point, with no casualties thanks to Guts' skills. Unfortunately, luck only lasts so long, as Guts discovered as his horse took an arrow to the neck, effectively killing the beast and stranding him with the enemy. As the odds began to look even worse for him, Guts' smile began to grow wider and wider until he looked like a demented version of his brother. He had held off the initial charge trying to flatten him, but turned around to find a rider with his sword in mid-swing at his head. Before he could react, the rider fell forward, a familiar dagger sticking out of the back of his neck. Naruto dismounted from his horse, taking off the enemy cloak he had stolen to blend in with the rest of the riders. He threw a small iron ball with a lit fuse into the horse's saddlebag before slapping it on the flank. The frightened animal ran back towards its brothers, making it to the front ranks before the bomb went off, sending pieces of man and horse in every direction. Guts turned to look at his brother with his eyebrow raised only to get a shrug in return. "I had one left," mumbled Naruto as they prepared for the next charge, this one led by the enemy captain himself. Out of nowhere, arrows flew over their heads into the enemy lines, making them draw back. Griffith thundered in with his horse in full gallop, his hand outstretched towards Guts. The berserker grabbed his leader's hand and was pulled up onto his horse as they turned to ride back towards the castle. He watched out of the corner of his eye as Yudo performed a similar maneuver with Naruto. They rode like madmen towards the opening in the trees ahead, the enemy almost upon them. As they broke from the forest, they split left and right, causing the enemy to slow as they tried to decide who to follow. This left the soldiers perfectly positioned to receive a broadside from the cannons in the barricade in front of the castle. The captain was killed in the blast, and with him went the morale holding the rest of the soldiers together. Their chaotic retreat could be heard long after they had disappeared into the trees, followed by the cheers of victory from the rest of the band of the Hawks. Naruto couldn't resist resting his head over Judo's shoulder and batting his eyelashes at him. "My hero," he said with an overdone sigh. The men close laughed at Judo's reddening face before he shoved Naruto off of his horse, causing him to tumble down to the dirt. The castle's noble had been waiting by the gatehouse, slowly building a rage at being ignored by Griffith. He had initially come out to congratulate the Hawks leader, only for Griffith to ignore him and ride back into the wilderness just to retrieve two nobodies. He'd had enough and needed to put this unruly mob back in its place. "Excuse me, Griffith," he called out. Once he had the group's attention, he continued. "Though you gave me a victory tonight, it's also left hundreds of armed men on my doorstep that could regroup in the next few days and continue the siege. I don't think it's time to pay the contract yet if dot." "Excuse me, my lord," Naruto interrupted as he picked himself up from the dirt. He pulled a previously unnoticed satchel from his back that had a large red stain on the bottom of it. He walked over to the noble before emptying the contents onto the ground. A charred head rolled to the noble's feet, the features still recognizable as the enemy general. A pile of fingers also fell out of the bag, forming a grisly pyramid on the ground. "I wanted to assure your fears of the enemy regrouping. I'm sure you recognize the head, but each of these fingers are from dead officers, you can tell by the house rings that they each show. There isn't any real leadership remaining back at that camp." He winked at Guts, who looked stunned at what his brother had just presented. "What? Did you think I showed up late to the fight for no reason?" Guts closed his mouth, knowing he should have expected something like this from Naruto. It had been his standard operating procedure to target leadership in every battle they ever fought. The Lord was truly frightened at what this group was capable of that he had led into his home. My, thanks for the reassurance," he murmured to Naruto, unable to tear his eyes away from the gore presented to him. He finally looked up at Griffith, whose eyes shone equal amounts of pride and mirth at the man's unease. "It looks like everything is in order. Please celebrate tonight while I gather your pay, along with a hefty bonus." He hurriedly moved back into his castle, followed by his servants. The Hawks cheered at the thought of more money. Life was looking up for them. Griffith softly smiled as looked at his men with pride, knowing that it would only get better from here. "Let's celebrate our success," he shouted as he turned towards the courtyard, followed by the rest of the band of the Hawk. The castle's courtyard was illuminated by multiple bonfires, each one surrounded by hundreds of men, all celebrating their resounding success against the numerically superior forces. The noise filled the courtyard with laughter, singing, and even a few fights, as men let loose the stress they had built over the weeks. Guts watched all of this from above as he was perched in the battlements of the castle, enjoying the night air. Naruto lay sprawled on the battlement next to him, hanging halfway off of it, with no fear of falling at all. "You know we're going to be drugged down there sooner or later, little brother. You might as well go on your own and save them the trouble of finding you." Guts just grunted at his brother's logic. He could take that and shove it if he thought Guts was going anywhere near a crowd voluntarily. They both went silent as they heard footsteps coming up the stairs towards them. Pippin, Judo, and Rickard all appeared, smiling and laughing as they enjoyed each other's company. "There you two are," exclaimed Judo, "you need to come on down to the party. It's being held for you after all." At Guts' raised eyebrow, he explained further. "We're celebrating you two finally becoming full members of the Band of the Hawk now that you've fought in battle with us." "Damn it, Guts," said Naruto as he stood up and walked over to the group. "Don't be such a pussy-ass bitch. They all know they can depend on you on the battlefield. Now it's time to show that you're just as dependable in everyday life." Guts grunted and turned away again. He might have gone before, but there was no way he was rewarding Naruto after that comment. He had just settled in when Pippin manhandled him up and threw him over his shoulder before walking back down to the party. Guts swung an elbow at him, drawing blood, but the giant wasn't even fazed from the temper tantrum and continued on towards the party. He looked up to see an upside-down image of his brother grinning at him as he followed behind. Guts was dumped on his head in the middle of the party. He was slowly building into a rage as he got to his feet, only to have a cup of alcohol shoved into his face by the giant. He looked around to see everyone around him holding up a similar cup as Judo made a toast to the two newest members, Guts who had saved them during the retreat and Naruto who had decapitated the enemy leadership. The men cheered as they all raised their glasses. Guts took a long pull from his as well, only to notice Griffith giving him a huge smile from across the campfire as he finally saw Guts join in. Porcus and his followers all skulked near the gatehouse, unable to bring themselves to join in the fun. Their hatred of Guts was too great, and it only grew worse with jealousy as he gained recognition from the Hawks. "I hate that guy," Porcus muttered under his breath. "One of these days I'll kill him." "You're shitting me, right?" said his friend. "None of us can take that guy in a fight, even together, we'd all die. And God only knows what Naruto would do if we went near his brother." They all gulped at that. No one wanted a piece of the blonde if even half the rumors were true about his skills. None of them noticed that they had eyes on their plotting and bitching. Asuka sat on a stairwell overlooking the party, her eyes were vacant though, as she tried to wrap her head around all the changes that were occurring to the band of the Hawks in the last few months, and to Griffith in particular. She had never seen Griffith ride back to save a member of the Hawks from certain death before, yet he did it for the brothers. She could see their value to the Hawks from a mile away, but she didn't know yet if the price was worth having them join. She would have to keep her distance from both of them until she could come up with a decision on her own. She also made a note to kick Corcus's ass later, as his conversation drifted up to her. Naruto woke up in Sea of Flesh the next morning. It looked like the Campors had taken a liking to him thanks to Guts. He opened his eyes only to have a head of hair fill his vision that was connected to a beautiful face and a set of large S. The girls had apparently drug his drunk ass over to their sleeping area and had dogpiled on him. He sighed with relief as he noticed he still had his pants on, as well as all of his money in his pouch. This definitely set a dangerous trend though as to the girls getting comfortable enough around him to seek him out when vulnerable for snuggling. He carefully removed himself from the pile while avoiding waking any of the sleeping females. He paused for a moment to get his bearings and heard laughter around the wall of the building next to him. Investigating the noise led to a scene that he wished he could record forever. His stubborn, mulish brother was actually having a water fight by the well with a Buck Griffith and laughing while he did it. They both calmed down after a few more minutes, sitting back against the well side by side in comfortable silence. They looked up at the sound of approaching footsteps, seeing Naruto approaching with a giant grin on his face. Well, Naruto said as he eyed his brother and friend. Griffith, I know Guts volunteered to be your bitch when you defeated him, but I'd at least think you'd buy him a drink before you seduce him. Guts wished he hadn't already relinquished his bucket, it would have made a great projectile to hurl at the blonde's head. Griffith simply nodded his head as he looked back at Naruto. Don't worry, he said while smirking at Guts. That's phase 2. Guts tried to subtly scoot away from the white-haired, only to be blocked by his brother who had sat down on his other side, sandwiching him between them. At this point Guts was desperate to change the conversation to damn near anything. What is that? He asked, gesturing to what looked like a red egg hanging from a chain on Griffith's neck. Griffith held up the necklace away from his body as he studied it. You mean this thing? He asked. I bought it from an old gypsy fortune teller a while ago. It's called the Behelite Egg of the King. They say whoever holds it is destined to obtain the world in exchange for his own flesh and blood. Here. He tossed it to Guts who pulled it closer to his face to examine it. As he looked closer he could see what looked like parts of a face including a mouth, nose, and eyes all spread randomly over the surface. All of a sudden, one of the eyes opened up, staring right at Guts. He could feel it almost examining his soul. He tossed it away quickly to Naruto. The blonde caught it, wondering what had freaked Guts out so bad. He noticed the eye on the egg staring back at him before the entire world around him went dark. He came to in what looked like an underground sewer filled with about a foot of water. There were pipes installed in the ceiling, but they all looked old and rusted out, some even having fallen into the ground below. The only pipe that looked to still be in use seemed to glow red at regular intervals like his pulse. He decided to follow the pipe seeing as how he had no idea where else to go to. He sloshed through the tunnel for what felt like hours before he came to what looked like a huge cavern. He couldn't even see far enough to tell where the walls and ceiling were in the room compared to himself. The only thing in the room was a rusted gate connected to a broken fence. The gate looked to have been forced open in the past and now barely hung on one hinge with a shredded piece of paper hanging from the handle. Naruto felt a sense of deja vu as he looked at the construct, yet knew he had never seen it before in his life. All of a sudden, he felt his conscience being pulled back to his real body and slowly disappeared from the cavern. If he had stayed a moment longer, he would have seen a gigantic red animal eye open from the darkness behind the gate, only to close again when it couldn't find anything there. But stared into the water of the castle's moat, barely able to comprehend what he had heard from Griffith earlier. Naruto had been staring off into space for a few minutes after catching the Behelite from Guts, barely breathing. Guts was considering pouring a bucket of water on the blonde's head when he jerked forward with a gasp before he cast a quick look of fear at the item in his hand and threw it back to its owner. That isn't natural, his brother mumbled to himself before turning to Griffith. You really need to be careful if you're planning on keeping it close to yourself. Guts had been waiting for the right opportunity to ask Griffith a question that had been eating at him. He recognized his chance as they all were longing for a change in subject. Why did you come back to save us? He asked. That seems like an incredible risk for a leader to take for only 2 of his people. Griffith leveraged himself up to dry off in the morning sun as he thought of his answer. You 2 are too valuable to me to waste in such a petty battle. You belong to me now and I will decide where you will die. At this point the sun was hitting Griffith from behind at such an intensity that he almost seemed to have an ethereal glow around him. Guts was finding himself almost hypnotized by the mere presence his commander seemed to possess. I will get my own kingdom, and you will help me fight to earn it. The moment was broke as Naruto gave a snort before looking up at Griffith. I get what you're saying, but you know the moment would be a lot deeper if you weren't completely dead. He cast a quick look down at Griffith's pride and joy before elbowing his brother. That water must be really damn cold, huh Guts? Guts couldn't help laughing before he heard a splash. He looked over to see Griffith holding an empty bucket and his brother dripping wet. Naruto stood there with his eye twitching for a moment before he dived for a free bucket. Griffith was already sprinting for cover while Guts grabbed a third bucket, deciding that it was high time he showed both of them who they were messing with. After the water fight had broken up, which in his opinion, Guts had definitely won, the boys had drifted their separate ways. Guts had needed some privacy to reflect on everything he had heard that day and had found the small dock by the moat a perfect place to do so. The man only has about 500 mercenaries and he says he'll get himself a kingdom like it's a sure thing. He's only about my age, yet he's so confident. Guts looked up at the sky, watching a few birds skimming over the treeline. What have I been doing the last few years? He thought to himself. Naruto and I have just been running from one battlefield to the next. Just killing enemies and surviving. He paused as he heard footsteps rushing down the tower stairs, only to be thrown into the water as the tower door was slammed open right behind him. Rickert stared in horror as he realized that he had just dumped his savior into the castle moat. I'm sorry Mr. Guts. He exclaimed. I just wanted to congratulate you on your promotion. I heard you already have 10 men placed under you after being a hawk for only a month. That's just amazing. He reached a hand out to help Guts out of the water. Guts stared at the hand, contemplating the offer for a moment. Just call me Guts, he said as he took the boy's hand. He began to climb up before he noticed a shadow envelope Rickert. Pippin came walking out of the stairwell, knocking Rickert and Guts both back into the moat. Casca watched a comedy from the ramparts above them. She resisted cracking a smile at the group's antics, holding herself to a higher standard. The Hawks had definitely become more lively with the addition of the brothers, but she still wasn't able to decide on if it was worth having them around yet. She looked to the side as saw another set of birds taking off from the trees, closer to the castle this time. Naruto had decided that some exercise was the best way to dry off after the water fight that he had most definitely won. He had gathered his gear for inventorying and cleaning when he had discovered that he had left his dagger back on the trail from the battle the night before. The dagger was the last gift he was given from Gambino before he had his breakdown. Besides their last night together, Gambino had been good to Naruto and Guts, showing them how to be both mercenaries and real men. Naruto refused to lose any more memories of his past after not remembering the first 4 years of his life. Hey, he called to the gate sentry, I'm going out to search the trail. Let anyone know if they're looking for me. The sentry waved down from his elevated position before signaling for the gates to be opened for his fellow Hawk. Naruto had walked for about half an hour before he found the location of he and his brother's last stand. Body parts laid all over the road and the stench was almost enough to make one retch. The denizens of the forest had already begun to remove what parts they could reach through the armor. He spied sunlight reflecting off of his dagger sticking out of the back of the neck of a body near the bottom of the main pile of corpses. He spent the next few minutes unpiling bodies to where he could reach his weapon before yanking it out of his victim's skull and cleaning it on the body's cloak. He heard a branch snap behind him and saw a pair of birds startle and take off from a tree above him. He whirled around towards the noise, still brandishing his dagger while moving his other hand towards his axe. Show yourselves. He ordered in a suppressed growl. There wasn't any need to alert the whole forest to the growing conflict if he could avoid it. A shape detached itself from the darkness of the trees, resolving itself into a man cautiously walking towards the blonde with his arms raised away from his sword. I know you, the man mumbled, you were the one who blew up our command tent during the battle. He paused a few feet from the blonde before offering a small smile and lowering his arms. Thank you from all of us foot soldiers for that, he said, offering his hand to Naruto to shake. They had been abusing us worse and worse as the supplies ran down and the stress worsened. Naruto grinned and scratched his head in embarrassment before taking the offered hand for a quick shake. It's no problem. Considering our raids were what caused your situation, I'm glad some good came out of it. What is it that you want from me though if you aren't interested in fighting? He relaxed his stance, though he kept his hands near his weapons in case of any signs of betrayal. It was the man's turn to look embarrassed this time as he tried to figure out how to word his request. First off, my name is Jared. You probably don't remember me, but we met last night and even spoke briefly. I was the first sentry to lay down my arms and lead the rest of the guys off through the forest after you gave us safe passage. Unfortunately, we're now deserters and the army won't take us back. I had the idea of possibly joining up with a band of the Hawk, but the rest of the guys said I was crazy for even considering it. I'm just glad I found you or I would have had to risk going to the castle to contact your group. Naruto made a split-second decision, judging Jared to be trustworthy enough to at least give a chance. Go gather up whatever gear and supplies you have and meet me here again in 1 hour. I'll have an answer by then on whether you can join up. The two parted ways with Naruto running back to the castle to locate Griffith. He found his leader sitting at a table near the castle's stables with Udo, Casca, Corcus, and Pippin, finalizing the Hawks' next plans due to their contract ending with the local lord. Griffith. Naruto said with a huff, trying to catch his breath after his sprint. What do I do if a former enemy wants to join up with the Hawks? We can't take in former enemies. Casca interjected before her commander could say anything. Griffith frowned at the interruption, but let his commander speak, hoping to get the opinion of one of his trusted people. Who knows what their motives might be? They could just be looking for an easy way to take revenge for their loss. Naruto gave her a deadpan look before talking to her very slowly and clearly, as if to a child or a mentally slow adult. You do realize that my brother and I were force recruited at Sword Point after you ambushed us just last month, right? Where was that logic then? Corcus couldn't hold back his laughter anymore. He was loving watching the normally strict woman be brought down a peg in the most humiliating way possible. He shut his mouth, almost biting his tongue in his haste as Casca turned towards him, looking for an outlet to release her rage, knowing that trying anything on the blonde was a lost cause. Naruto turned back to Griffith, knowing he had his full attention now. I'm not saying to trust him immediately, but how the hell else is the Hawk supposed to grow if we don't take in defeated enemies? Think about it, they come already trained, most have their gear already, and they're already suitably intimidated by us from earlier defeats to try to attempt anything. If you want to reach your kingdom, then you'll need an army to reach it, he finished, giving Griffith a look of significance. Griffith could see Naruto's point, but wanted to add some stipulations on the idea, considering he had the last word in who joined. I'll allow defeated enemies to join, he offered, shooting Casca a look to shut her up before she could start complaining, but we won't force anyone to join, except in extreme circumstances. He offered a nod to Naruto, recognizing the unusual circumstances of the blonde's recruitment. If they volunteer to join, then they're to be treated like any other recruit with trust earned over time and merit. He stood up, effectively ending the meeting, and walked around the table to Naruto. Where is the man wanting to join, and who is he? Naruto threw a thumb back over his shoulder to the woods that could be seen through the open gate. I told him to meet me back at the final battleground, where you rescued Guts and me the night before. It's not like he's able to come back with me to the castle with me, the guards would kill him on sight. You guys have actually met him before, he was the guard we spared that told us where the command tent was last night. Griffith indeed remembered the man, appreciating that guard had enough common sense to recognize his position, instead of dying like a fanatic. Finish gathering the men, he ordered his commanders. Let's move on to our next job. I've hopefully found us a steady line of work with Midland's army. We can gather our new recruit on the way. Everyone rushed off to perform their duties. There was an excitement in the air for the Band of the Hawk. They had finally gathered enough fame to be recognized as possible assets by national armies, and Griffith was throwing them in with the side losing the war. Desperation breeds vultures, and the Hawks would have plenty of opportunities in the future to elevate themselves on the battlefield. The sound of horses could be heard thundering down the dirt path away from the castle again, though this time in the opposite direction, towards the lands in the distance. Naruto rode ahead of the front line, acting as a scout as they approached the meeting point for himself and Jared. He spotted the man waiting on the side of the road, trying to put as much distance between himself and the leftover gore from the battle as possible. Griffith signaled for his men to halt before riding forward to meet his new subordinate, who was talking to Naruto. Griffith, this is Jared. He's looking to join our merry band. Jared bowed to Griffith, much to Naruto's mirth and his new commander's ire, unknowingly treating him like any other lord he had worked for instead of a mercenary leader. I'm sorry, Naruto, but there's been some complications since we spoke. Naruto frowned at the man, knowing that his reputation was on the line as well after vouching for him. What is this complication that you speak of? Griffith asked as he dismounted his horse and took over the conversation. Jared cast a quick look over his shoulder at the woods, causing the other two to grow alarmed and move their hands towards their weapons. No. It's nothing like that, he said, trying to defuse the situation. When I went back to my camp to gather my supplies like Naruto instructed, I ran into the rest of the guards that I had deserted with. They hadn't thought that I could actually get into the Hawks and asked to join as well when they heard the news. They're waiting a few hundred feet down the road so as not to surprise you. Naruto blinked at the news before turning to Griffith. Well, that's good news, right? A few dozen more men for the Hawks couldn't do anything but help. Griffith could feel a headache coming on as he thought over the situation. He was beginning to understand that no situation with the blonde was ever going to be as simple as it was initially presented. Jared cleared his throat, grabbing his commander's attention again, much to Naruto's relief. Actually, it's not a couple dozen men. You see, my friends returned to their camps, and word spread to others who had left the army after the battle. There's actually about 500 men waiting to join down around the next bend. They're all armed, but only about half of them have provisions and horses. The rest lost theirs in the flames. Naruto could feel Griffith staring a hole in the back of his head as he jogged down the trail to peek around the edge of the turn. He could see men lining both sides of the road, waiting silently. He ran back to the meeting point at top speed, noticing that the rest of the commanders had pulled forwards as well to hear what was going on. So, he's not lying, Naruto offered sheepishly as he scratched the back of his head. The road is thick with men right around the corner waiting to join. He coughed a few times as Casca's glare was turned full force on him, making him want to hide behind something. "You're welcome," he mumbled to Griffith as he walked by the commander on his way back to his horse. He indicated for Jared to mount up and follow him, taking pity on the poor man and removing him from the awkward situation. Griffith took a moment to calm down, promising himself that he would have a talk with Naruto later to remind him about who was in charge and who was the subordinate. He pushed all of his feelings down and re-established his commander's presence again before setting his horse forwards in a trot around the bend. He immediately felt hundreds of eyes fall on him as he rode forwards a few paces before stopping to address the assembled men. "I'm told that you are looking for a new purpose for your lives. The Band of the Hawk can offer that for all that are interested. We are a family and look out for each other. Your happiness is my happiness, and your pain is my pain. Follow me if you are ready to take the first step towards greatness." The assembled men erupted in applause, his own men behind joining in as well. He paused, letting the cheers from the men die down, a devious thought floating to the surface in his head. "I want all of the new recruits to report to Naruto after you get settled in this evening," he said, looking over his shoulder and indicating the blonde who had a confused look on his face. "He'll take an inventory of what everyone needs to become combat able and what you need for camp supplies. Take all of your problems to him until further notice." He watched the blonde's face fall farther and farther as he continued, barely able to hold in his laughter and stay professional. A grinning Casca slapped the blonde on the back while she rode forwards as the rest of the Hawks began to travel again, the recruits joining the veterans on the trail. Guts rode forwards to his brother, unable to resist giving him a hard time. "You know this wouldn't have happened if you hadn't made fun of his dick size after the water fight, right?" As the blonde woodenly turned his head towards his brother, Guts nodded to himself as if realizing some great concept. "I don't feel nearly as bad now about having to look after 10 men, considering you have 500 to handle." He took off with a cackle as he heard his brother's sword sliding from its sheath, riding forwards to join Judo and Pippin as they mocked the blonde for the rest of the ride. 5 years later. Green hills rolled as far as the eye could see. A breeze blew between the hills, playing with the wildflowers that grew in random patches. A tree sat alone on top of one of the hills, throwing up a shadow over a single figure taking shelter from the rising heats cast by the early afternoon sun. Judo sat, perched in the lower branches of the tree, using the view it afforded him to watch the status of the battle between the armies of Midland and Shooter. The flow of the battle seemed to be even at the moment, one side would surge, only for the other to rally and surge back. The ground was turning to mud, saturated with the blood from the bodies of both sides, piling up underfoot and ground into the soil under heel. The horn could be heard blowing from the Shooter command post in one of the back hills. Judo sighed to himself as he watched a dark mass flow over the hills one by one, resolving into knights decked out in black armor with ram horns on their helmets and wielding vicious lances and riding armored steeds. Someone on Shooter's side must be getting bored, he thought to himself as he watched the ensuing slaughter. The black ram iron lance heavy cavalry crashed into the flank of the Midland army with a crash that could be heard from miles, effectively drowning out the screams of its victims. Those that weren't speared on the lances were ground under their horses' hoofs. The first soldier turned and fled, soon followed by another, then another. In minutes, a well-organized defense turned into a route leaving a wide-open path towards Midland's command post, where its generals and King himself viewed the battle in mounting horror. Judo had been ordered by Griffith to watch for a moment like this. He was to signal the Hawks who had laid in wait one hill over, letting them know the perfect time to intervene in the battle to let them gain maximum credit for saving the day. As the commander of the Black Rams reformed his cavalry for the final charge, Judo prepared to send the signal before he spied 2 figures standing in the middle of the field between the Rams and the command post. "What the hell, oh god damn it," he thought to himself as he recognized exactly who the figures were. "You get 5 minutes," he silently told them, "then I'm calling in the rest." Naruto looked out the corner of his eye at his brother as they sat on their horses, side by side on the field. 5 years had done both of the brothers a world of good by the time puberty had hit them. Both of them had become taller than damn near anyone else in the Hawks, with Guts topping out at 6'1" and Naruto at 6 even. Guts was noticeably thicker in muscle, to correspond with his sword that he had increased in size to match his body's growth. He was so powerful now that he didn't even need a real edge to his sword, his strength and the sword's momentum were enough to cut through damn near anything. Naruto had stayed leaner but still had enough power to weather his brother's attacks, if not push back against them. His speed had increased though to the point where his attacks looked like blurs to the average eye. Only those that constantly dueled him were able to predict his movements enough to last against him for a prolonged period of time. Guts' lust for battle had only increased as he aged. He was fast becoming a combat junkie, unable to even consider life past the next fight. Only Naruto and Griffith were able to keep him grounded in their own ways. This had to lead to many uncomfortable moments with other Hawks like Casca, who couldn't stand Guts abandoning plans and formations to go off and battle singularly. One of those moments was happening now. Naruto reflected to himself as he watched his brother prepare to meet the charge of the approaching Rams. "Remind me to kick your ass for dragging me out here later," he gripped at his brother. "Now I have to listen to Casca for not keeping you responsible to your unit and the overall plan." "Relax, big brother," Guts offered with a small smirk. He loved addressing Naruto with that title, now that he was finally visibly larger than him. "No one forced you out here with me. I just want to meet these elites of Judah in battle before the Hawks sweep them away. You know this is what I do best." He felt his blood begin to pump harder as the enemy closed in, his brain's higher functions shut down one by one as his body shifted fully into battle mode. His smile began to grow wider and wilder as his excitement built. "I'm here because you're here, you dumb shit," Naruto responded back blandly, getting an angry snort from his brother. "I can't let you into a battle like this without watching your back. Think about that next time you risk both of our lives for something stupid like you're not even listening to me, are you?" Guts chose that moment to slap Naruto's horse's flank, sending it forward, before immediately charging after while drawing his gigantic blade. "It's only 2 horsemen against the entire Black Ram heavy iron cavalry. Mow them down," ordered the commander as he shot towards the blonde rider in the lead, leaving the black-haired swordsman for his lieutenants and their men. Naruto narrowed his eyes as the enemy commander veered towards him. He had made quite a name for himself over the years, always trying to target the enemy leaders on the battlefield. He always aimed for the least loss of life on the battlefield, and in his view, decapitating the enemy leadership ended the fight quicker than anything else. Usually he had to navigate the battlefield to locate them, but every now and then he got lucky, and one of them came right to him like this Dumbus. The Ram's commander closed a distance, setting his lance into his shoulder and setting his body to brace for impact. This was the moment Naruto was waiting for, as the blonde wing throwing knife at the commander, bouncing it off of his helmet with enough force to throw his head back. The commander reflexively dropped his lance as he grabbed at his helmet in panic at the unexpected attack. The blonde had reached the commander at his moment of distraction, allowing him to take a mighty swing with his sword, decapitating the man's head. To the horror of the Rams, Naruto caught the head as he rode by, before jamming it onto a spike mounted on the back of his saddle. The Rams couldn't believe the audacity of the blonde swordsman that had killed their commander and taken such a grisly trophy. Their charge faltered at the worst possible moment as they tried to figure out what to do next. Guts hit them like a tidal wave, his blade cutting through the lieutenant commander and one other in a single swing. He carved a straight line through the entire cavalry before turning around to charge again. Naruto had followed his brother through the hole formed by his charge, widening it further as he attacked Rams on both sides while protecting his brother's back. The Rams at the end of the pack turned away from the battle as they heard a rumble start to get louder. They froze at the sight of the entire band of the Hawk surging around the base of the King's Hill, heading straight towards their enemy with the White Hawk Griffith in the lead. The Hawks were on them in moments, slaughtering anyone that they could reach. The Rams turned to retreat, only to face Naruto and Guts still fighting at their back, bottlenecking their route of retreat. Less than an hour later, only a handful of Rams had managed to flee the battlefield, with the Tudor army that had retreated at the sight of their elite unit being truly decimated. Griffith rode towards the brothers as the battle wound down, taking off his helmet and offering a smile and a thumbs up to his heavy hitters. Guts offered a tired smile back with his sword propped up on his shoulder. He was covered in blood, though very little of it was actually his thanks to the efforts of his brother. Naruto looked pissed off at his brother, unable to comprehend why they had to put themselves in so much danger. Guts dismounted his horse and was about to greet Griffith when he felt something heavy smash against the back of his helmet. He turned to see the head of the Ram's commander rolling away on the ground and Naruto wiping his hand off on a cloth. "What the hell, Naruto?" he shouted as he stomped towards his brother, slamming his forehead into the blondes as they stared eye to eye. "You know I hate it when you throw severed heads at me. What the hell was that for?" "Because you drugged me into a battle we didn't need to fight alone, you dumb shit," Naruto responded before shoving his brother back a few feet. "You know damn well that the plan called for us to attack the enemy from the sides, trapping them, yet you still rode out alone, making me follow. So I'll throw as many heads at you as I want until you stop being stupid." Naruto picked up another random head, still in its helmet, before flinging it at his brother, nailing him right in the face. "That's it. I'm kicking your ass, big brother," shouted Guts as he threw down his sword and charged the blonde, spearing him with his shoulder and sending both of them down into the dirt. He maneuvered his way on top of the blonde's back before getting him in a headlock and digging his knuckles into Naruto's scalp. Asuka rode up in a huff, ready to light into Guts for his lone wolf move when she saw the brothers rolling around on the ground. Naruto already handling talking to Guts. She asked Griffith, who was calmly watching the fight. At his nod, she turned to walk away, shouting over her shoulder, "Get him for me too, Naruto." The hand shot out of the tangle, giving her a thumbs up before it was pulled back into the battle. Griffith watched her leave before turning back to the fight, seeing Naruto laying under Guts with his legs wrapped around Guts' bicep while he held the other one with both arms, trapping his brother in a crucifix-style hold. "I'm not the same man I was those years ago," Guts mumbled as he relaxed into the hold, realizing he couldn't break it. "I care about my men, and I care about the Hawks." "I know, little brother," Naruto said as began to release Guts, now that the fight had worn out of him. "None of us are the same kids that we were back then, we've all grown and matured. All of us except for Mr. Man Pretty over there," he said, inclining his head towards their friend who had been waiting patiently for them. Griffith calmly offered Guts a hand before pulling him up to his feet. He then took out his water skin and poured it over the blonde's head before pulling him to his feet as well. They walked back towards their camp in a comfortable silence. 1 week later. Naruto watched Guts practicing with his sword in the courtyard of the cathedral. Griffith was to be knighted by the king in a ceremony inside, giving him the rank of Viscount and allowing the band of the Hawk to become actual soldiers in the army instead of having to stay as mercenaries. "Is there a reason you aren't going inside?" asked Naruto as he sat on the rail and watched his brother practice. "From what I can see, you came prepared to." He nudged Guts' armor with his foot where it had been cast aside on the ground. "He doesn't need us for this," grunted Guts as he completed his 200th swing of his weighted sword. "We're there to support him in battle, not politics." He switched hands, ready to start the count over with his offhand. But there's where you're wrong," Naruto corrected him as he jumped down and started to redress his brother in his armor. "Politics is just another form of battle, and if you're serious in helping him and the Hawks, then you need to support him on this battlefield too. When he looks back, he needs to see that we are all there for him." He slapped Guts on the arm before gesturing towards the chapel door. "Come on, let's go inside and hide in the back to avoid Casca. We can hide your sword behind that big plant near the entrance, since you can't go unarmed." The brothers entered the church swiftly and silently, their many years as mercenaries reflecting on their skill. They took a spot along the back wall just in time to see Casca, who was obviously looking for them. She could only glare impotently due to the distance between them, causing Naruto to grin and wave at the all-too-serious girl. The rest of the nobles hadn't noticed them enter and proceeded to carry on their whispered conversations. The common consensus was that the knighting of a mercenary was a complete break in decorum and a travesty to both the nobles' positions of power, as well as the realm in general. Naruto took note of the few nobles who spoke out in favor of tying the Hawks officially to Midland through titles, marking them down in his mind as possible future allies for Griffith. The ceremony was wrapping up and Griffith stood to receive congratulations from the crowd for his new title. He nodded to his commanders in the front row, but he grew a beaming smile when he saw the brothers in the back of the church clapping for him. He hadn't realized just how much it meant to him for them to show up and support until just now. 6 months later. The overcast sky darkened the land beneath it, giving the castle an ominous look. Griffith rolled the behelit around in his hand as he watched his hawk spread over the enemy fortress like ants attacking a free meal. Whenever he held the charm, he couldn't help but think back to the day he had told Naruto and Guts about his dream of achieving his own kingdom. The behelit had opened an eye as if it was inspecting each of the boys, but only Griffith didn't have an odd reaction to it. He took that as a sign that he was the only one of the three who had what it took to achieve his dream. He had just been updated by a runner that the fortress was all but taken with the exception of the enemy citadel. There was an enemy of great strength holding the Hawks back from getting to the enemy lord, but Guts and Naruto were both looking into the matter personally with their men. Judo mumbled from behind Griffith, catching his and the rest of his commanders' attention. Noticing their looks, Judo clarified what he said. "I had heard a rumor before we had set out that the Nosferatu Zod had joined the enemy forces." He gave a half-hearted chuckle as he looked up at his companions. "Something tells me that if Guts ran into him, he'd go charging headlong into the battle like a madman." The others laughed, seeing the humor in it, but Griffith began to grow panicked as he realized the truth to the statement. A flash of lightning illuminated two figures, taller than the rest of the men, go charging into the castle. Griffith grasped the reins on his horse and charged down the hill, alarmed shouts of his subordinates echoing behind him. He had to make it in time. Thanks for watching this video. If you really enjoy this video, like, subscribe, and comment down below, and turn on that bell notification. Don't forget to support and follow Mojothaspasimonki for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story, link in the description. See you in the next video. Goodbye.